So, uh, Kant has actually four ways in which he expresses this categorical imperative. Now, remember, there is only one categorical imperative, but he states it in four, or typically it's thought of as three different ways, but one can actually conceive it, some do, as four different ways. Some others even go as far as six different ways. There's no sort of really need to do that by breaking these down into sort of the embedded ideas within each. But we can talk about four or three different ways, and they're all supposed to be equivalent. Each of these formulations will produce the same conclusions regarding the morality of a particular action. The first one we have already seen, the formula of the law of nature or the formula of universal law. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. We have seen that already. The second one we can call sort of the formula of humanity, or let's say the formula of the end in itself. What does this mean? This is the idea here of, where, we're back to this means ends formulations that existing ends are always connected to certain means. But Kant argues that rational nature exists as an end in itself. I value my own rationality. So I ought to respect the rationality of other beings. Or to put it simply, and we'll come back to this, treat people as ends, not only as means to your own ends. So treat humanity as such as an end. Now that's why I often refer to this as a formula of humanity. This sort of gives rise to the third formula, which is generally not the one taken up. Typically, it's the first, second, and the fourth that refer to the three formulations of categorical imperative: the formula of universal law, the formula of the end in itself, and the formula of the kingdom of ends. Here you can insert this third step in between so that you have four of them to see how it flows. So having seen the second categorical imperative, the formula of treating others and humanity as large, not, as ends rather than simply as means. Treating humanity always as ends in themselves. Since we respect our own rationality, value our own rationality, we have to value the rationality of others. We can't just always treat them as means for my own ends. They are ends in themselves. So this, in other words, gives rise to a third expression, the formula of autonomy, which sort of expresses certain impositions of some restrictions of using others as means. So the formula of autonomy imposes certain constraints or restrictions of using others as means, and this kind of just basically turns the formula of universal law around to emphasize the autonomy of the rational being. So act that your will can regard itself as this at the same time as making universal laws through its maxims. So this emphasizes the autonomy of your will, and you always act such that you recognize that autonomous or the free nature of your own will. Going back to earlier what we have said, you have to have this sense of an autonomy of your own will if you're going to go through this whole exercise of formulating a maxim and then assuming that this maxim could become universal law. Now, if you didn't have your own will, you wouldn't be able to go through these exercises. Even if you identified what's guiding your action, you would not be able to assume that, let's take this to be a law that's binding to everybody. So this is sort of the key aspect of this third formulation, the formula of autonomy. So act that your will can regard itself at the same time as capable or as making universal laws through its maxims. This formula of autonomy, this principle of every human will as a will that is capable of producing universal laws, leads us to a sort of formula of the kingdom of ends, which is like a formula of a community. The idea that there is a regulated community where every rational being must act as if uh, her uh, by her will By her maxims, at all times, she was acting as a lawmaking member of this community. So act as if you were, through your maxims, a lawmaking member of a kingdom of ends. Now, we won't go through all of these. I just want to point out the second of these, the formula of the end in itself, and show how that produces the same results as we saw with the first one, the formula of universal law, turning to those four examples that we had. Okay, so we just look at these two formulations. We have already looked at the formula of the law of nature. Now let's look at the formula of humanity, or the formula of the end in itself. So act so as to treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, as an end in itself, and never as means only. And we can illustrate, and Kant does illustrate this second principle using those same four examples that we have seen, plus a couple of others, the stealing also, we can throw in. And this gives you a sense how these are just different ways of expressing the uh, uh, categorical imperative through different sorts of formulations and the equivalence of these formulations. They give the same results. False promise. When you're making a false promise according to this formulation now, I'm using other person as a means to get money. And that's immoral. Similarly, taking one's own life. I'm using myself as a means to end my suffering. Same with imperfect duties, talent. I use myself, my life, my rationality purely for enjoyment, not giving myself respect as an irrational agent. Similarly, with charity or helping others, I'm not giving others respect as a rational agent, allowing them to develop their rationality, and so on. And finally, with the example he doesn't use, but we have, with stealing, I'm using other persons to get their property. So in all of this, we get a sense of how each of those, I mean, I've just given you the brief sort of conclusions of each of those examples using that second formulation. We don't need to go through the entire bit. But in each, as you can see, that the violation of each of those examples would lead to a violation of the formula of humanity, or the formula of end in itself. Because you're either using another person to get their money, or using another person to get their property, or you're using yourself as a means to end suffering, or you're using sort of your own life purely for enjoyment and not giving yourself respect as a rational agent. You don't want to live in a world where you don't give yourself respect as a rational agent, or give others respect as a rational agent, where the charity part comes in. So that kind of concludes our long lecture here. But let me end with a couple of sort of major problems, some of which I've already hinted at. The big issue that emerges here, as you have already caught on by now, anything that is not regarded as rational has no moral worth and can be treated as means only. You can just use them for your own ends. And and that it is morally permissible, for example, in this case then, to use an animal simply as a means, that you have no duty to an animal. Now, this is quite odd. Let's break this down a little bit. This idea that anything that's not rational has no moral value and can be treated as means only. That we owe animals nothing. They are not moral agents, they don't matter. Even though they feel pain, there is no way you can act immorally towards a dog, let's say, can't things, towards an animal, let's say, can't things, you know. Because, let's say, a cat or a dog isn't rational. They don't have any rights, according to Kant. Because in order to have rights, they would have to be rational, and they would have to be a member of a moral community. To be a member of a moral community, to be a member of a kingdom of ends, they have to be a rational agent. And since animals don't have rationality, they don't have rights, and they don't have, you don't have any moral duty towards them. Animals do feel pain, no doubt, as we have seen already with utilitarians. Bentham counted their pain as a measure in his hedonic principle. You know. But Kant thinks they don't count morally, even if they feel pain. Now, this is, of course, highly problematic in a way if you think about it. So, if I kick a dog and cause pain, uh, you know, according to Kant, Kant says I'm not doing something wrong to the dog because I have no duties to the dog. But all of us would have some problems with this notion. You know, let's take it. You might have. I'll leave it there. Let's take it further. What about uh, some things that people might treat as the same as animals who don't have rationality or have lost rationality or the rational faculty in the way we have talked about rational agents capable of acting according to logic, according to reason, according to morality, and so on. What about infants or the mentally afflicted or the mentally ill or the elderly who have gone senile? I mean, if they're mentally no different from animals, can we also treat them simply as means? Don't we have any moral duties towards them? I mean, you can see this is leading to a real problem here. Now, some Kantians have tried to get around this. That they argue, well, infants will one day grow up to be rational, and mentally ill could be rational. You know, maybe they have moments of rationality, or through treatment they may become rational, and so on. Or the elderly who may have gone senile now were rational at one time. In other words, they try to argue that they were or they will be in the future members of the rational species of beings, of humans. So we should count them and treat them as rational beings, even if they're lacking or have lost the faculty of rationality. That they're members of the rational species, and therefore we owe them moral duty also. We have to treat them as morally, and we cannot treat them simply as means to our ends. And finally, as I've mentioned, for long many non Europeans were considered to be lacking in rationality by Kant and many other sort of philosophers of his times in Europe and so on. This was and has justified widespread sort of appropriation of their lands. The lands of indigenous populations in the New World have been by and large appropriated by Europeans who went and settled there, who justified it. Kant himself justifies it in terms of his notion of private property, in his whole understanding of what is mine and what is thine. And he bases that all on a concept of rationality. And those lacking rationality, we don't owe them any moral duty. This has also led to widespread extermination of populations and a disregard and disrespect, some would argue that might even continue to this day, of the persons and rights of non-Europeans. So here, this is sort of a very troubling aspect of Kantian morality. Some Kantians have tried to argue that, well, you can separate these sort of racist or racial inclinations from his actual moral theory. But yet, given the centrality he gives to this notion of rationality, and then denying this rationality in certain beings, intimately wraps up this racism, a denial of their rationality entirely based on certain very spurious and over time proved to be completely false, misguided notions of racial superiority, brain power, and all linked to notions of rationality and all. All of that is just bunk, just garbage, scrap. You know? But those have been used to carry out widespread grabbing people's land, exterminating people, and disregarding and disrespecting their rights. So this very problematic aspect of this moral framework does remain. This was a long lecture. Thank you for your patience. Now we'll move to shorter versions, hopefully, in the next one.